Just Energy with naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theories that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swing of a pendulum to the waves in the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. In the same way, things such as rocks and minerals vibrate very slowly and at speeds that are imperceptible to us. Living things such as plants, animals, and man vibrate faster and appear to be alive. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is if we take everything in our own universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita as she explores questions such as, what are we made of? Why do we get sick? How can I live a more balanced and whole life? Call in and talk to her and her thought-provoking guests. Send us your questions and get the help you need to move beyond any obstacles or challenges that may be affecting your life, right from the source. So stay tuned and explore your possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Great show. Got Dan Millman for the first half hour, and then the second hour and a half, we're going to be talking to Michael Cremo about forbidden archaeology. A couple of announcements quick before I bring Dan on. So next month is the Big Texas Ghost Show happening in Beaumont, Texas. I'll be there talking about ghost spirits and all things that go bump in the night. I think they have a few VIP tickets left, and if you're interested in those or coming to the event, go to www.txparanormal.com. Also, coming up next month is the Spirit Spectacular Show. I want to do a big call-out to my friends in Des Moines and in Minnesota. I will be actually at the Ancient Ways bookstore in Des Moines on the 25th. I will be at the Eye of Horus bookstore on March 26th giving a presentation, and then all weekend at the Spirit Spectacular Show, which is being held at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Minneapolis, doing private sessions and speaking both days. And to get more information about that event, visit www.spiritspectacularshows.com. Okay, so let's just get going. So in this first part of the show, we're going to be talking to a former guest and friend of the show, Dan Millman, about his new book, Bridge Between Worlds. Let me tell you a little bit about Dan, and we will get him on air. Dan Millman is a former world champion athlete, university coach, martial arts instructor, and college professor. After an intensive 20-year spiritual quest, Dan's teachings found its form as the Peaceful Warrior's Way, expressed fully in his books and lectures. His work continues to evolve over time and meet the needs of the changing world. So please welcome to Just Energy Radio, Dan Millman. Hi, Dan. How are you?
And certainly a friend of Just Energy Radio. I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, thanks for coming back on the show. Your new book, Bridge Between Worlds. People are so familiar with you, with your Peaceful Warrior series, and this just seems like such an unexpected shift from what I'm familiar with you with. So why did you decide to write this book?
Well, Ram Dass once said, we can be lost in cosmic bliss and still be responsible for remembering our zip code. And I've always felt that. That's why what I teach normally, Rita, is how to live with our head in the clouds but our feet on the ground. And that's a stretch for some of us. And yes, a lot of my work focuses on the practical, everyday elements, kind of bridging flesh and spirit, peaceful heart but warrior spirit, that kind of balance. And each of my books is quite different, describing a different facet of what I call a peaceful warrior's approach to daily life. And even if everything is energy, we still have to take out the trash, brush our teeth, and live our daily lives. So when my friend Doug Childers, he's a very good writer, editor, we're good friends, came by the house and said, hey, let's write a book together. I said, well, Doug, I'm doing pretty well on my own after, at that time it was about 12 books. And he said, well, let me, just hear me out. And he described the nature of the story to me, and it was, extraordinary experiences that changed lives, and stories ranging from, one of the stories in there is about me shattering my right leg in about 40 pieces in a motorcycle crash, an event that changed my life. But there are other stories about the Flying Friar, an actual 1,000 pages of documentation on Joseph of Cupertino, who was witnessed by the Pope and royalty and others floating through the air over their heads. It's an astonishing story, hard to believe, and yet it's the best documented. And stories about Buckminster Fuller. So Doug had already researched about 15 stories, and so I ended up editing his stories. I found stories of my own, and we rejected stories that were obviously mythology or just something from the traditions that, it wasn't very credible. But we took those stories that were compelling and as true as we could possibly determine based on our research. And so because this book was different, Rita, that's why I ended up doing it, because I'd never really addressed this, the facets of mystery and miracles and angels in our lives. So it's meant to be an inspiration to anybody and remind people of what's possible in their own lives.
So do you believe there are otherworldly, mystical, magical powers that operate in our personal endeavors that help and support us along our path?
Well, my buddy Deepak Chopra once said, and I liked the way he said it, so I as President Calvin Coolidge once said, I use not only all the brains I have, but all I can borrow. And what he said was the magic of yesterday is the science of today, and the magic of today may be the science of tomorrow. So I'm not sure what magic is, except something that seems to transcend the laws of nature as we know them. It's not a major part of my work because, as I said, I like keeping feet on the ground. The Arabs say, trust in God, but tie your camel, so I like to keep it practical. And yet, it's not, the book isn't just about angels and praying for healing. It's about things that happen to people. And whether the things seemed fairly ordinary, like having a vision. Somebody has a vision, an image, a dream, or whether it's something extraordinary that people really can't explain through our what we know about science right now. The point was these experiences changed someone's life. It turned their life around. Sean Kilcoyne, in the story From Skinhead to Godhead, Sean was an absolute racist. He went in and out of one prison after the other, and absolutely was one of the most bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited people you could possibly imagine. And I'm not going to go into the whole story, but it's one example that he had a vision. And, a lot of people have visions through one means or another, but this vision transformed his life. And he ended up walking up to a black man at a bus stop. And he said he couldn't believe it, but he felt no hatred. And he said, hello. Now, to someone else, that's not such an extraordinary thing. But to this young man, it was like a transcendental experience. He'd never spoken to a black person without anger and hatred before, and they spoke a little bit, and from then on, now he's marching, he's heading through China as a missionary on his own, just marching through the country of China, telling people about his experience and how we can turn our lives around. That's just one of there's such a variety of stories. If you look through the book, by the way, Bridge Between Worlds is the title of the book, and the reason we call it Bridge Between Worlds is each of us lives in two worlds. We live in the conventional world that I hinted at before, doing our daily activities, paying the taxes, taking out the trash, going to work, taking the kids to school, and so on. But we also live in a transcendental world, another reality, and each has its own truths. The problem is we get so mired in our day-to-day life, which is our appropriate business, of course, but it captures our attention. And we often don't have the free attention to start to notice the transcendent possibilities in life. And that's why we wrote Bridge Between Worlds, to provide that kind of bridge so people can begin to notice once again the extraordinary things that can happen amidst our apparently ordinary lives.
I find that, for most people, excuse me, when they experience trauma or life challenges or have amazing life experiences, it forces them to reevaluate and refocus their lives. And many times it takes them into a better place and sometimes into a miraculous place, which is what you talk about in this book.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, one of the stories, called Remember the Music, is about a personal friend. She was my wife's roommate during college. Her name is Carol Benjamin. And when she was 9 years old, music entered her life in the sensuous shape of a cello. And for 25 years, her music graced the halls of her home, her school, the Oberlin College Conservatory, and finally the Fort Wayne Philharmonic Orchestra. Then a series of tragedies happened to her. We know Carol personally. She related her story to me. And Carol's life, I mean, she was not in what you would call a metaphysical or New Age or religious or spiritual person, very good, nice person, but she was just, a fairly typical person growing up doing her music. And then she found out after a series of difficulties that she had a liver cancer and she was going to need a transplant and she was going to die. And she ended up, and again, what makes this story effective is she just was not a believer of any kind. She began to have communications and seeing these beings. She said, I felt so cared for by these beings. They felt like friends with whom I had shared 100 lifetimes. When I saw them, it was like I was going home. And I felt a joyous remembrance that they had always been there, but somehow I'd forgotten this wonderful truth. It was as if I'd had amnesia all these years. And this is her word. She said, I gave up completely to whatever was to be. I told them, if I'm needed to serve, then I trust you'll keep me alive. If I'm not needed to serve, then I'll go. Then the Saturday night before her transplant, well, other things happened. The point is, Carol lost all fear of death after this. She had this experience with these beings. It was like near-death experiences we've read about in some other books. She just had it was just like going home. There's no fear of death anymore. So that was her transformation. And by the way, after her liver transplant, which she did get, she's been alive and well for the last 25 years, doing fine.
Woohoo! That's great.
Yeah.
That is excellent.
But again, this is one story. There are very different ones. The Scientist of Sacred Energy. The opening story in the book about Buckminster Fuller usually brings tears to people's eyes. They've heard of I heard of Bucky Fuller. Didn't he invent that geodesic dome? And wasn't he some kind of scientist? That's what most people know about him. They don't know about how he confronted, why he ended up standing over his frozen or, the chill waters of Lake Michigan in winter, ready to throw himself into the water. They don't know why that happened or what happened, but we cover that in the book, and it's an extraordinarily moving story about the transformation of Buckminster Fuller and what brought him back into the world to make many amazing contributions.
And all of these people that you talk about in the book, I mean, they're just regular people that have had, I'm going to say, quote-unquote, these extraordinary experiences that have put them in a position that they've gotten the notoriety that they have currently.
Well, we're all ordinary people, and you know this, and I know this, but it's easy to forget. We put people up on pedestals, that we look at their roles they play in life. One thing, whatever somebody's politics, one thing I very much like about President Obama is you get to know his family. They deal with the dog. His wife takes him to task a lot. Michelle does. So they're really regular people. They're not royalty, even though he is the president of the United States. I mean, whatever somebody's politics, he reminds us, like many famous people, that we put our pants or whatever, our clothes on the same way, and we're all ordinary people. But there are people in this book who are extremely well known, that are famous people, and there are other people who are not known at all, like our friend Carol. But they also had some just extraordinary events happen to them. One of them, some people have heard of, Robert Monroe, the Monroe Institute. Robert Monroe was a businessman, and he was in no way, interested in spiritual things. He was born in Basel, Switzerland, 1875. Oh, I'm sorry, this is The Voyager Within. I was just going to read about Carl Jung. He's one of the famous people. He was a mentor and a student and a colleague of Sigmund Freud. And Jung ended up, quite a famous man, and it tells the stories of how he made his discovery. But what I was talking about previous to that was Robert Monroe, who was a pretty empirical, engineering type. But one day he felt ill. He had a cold coming on, and he lay down on the couch, and he looked down and he saw his arm fall off the couch. He rolled over and his arm fell to the floor. But then he realized his arm hadn't fallen to the floor, and he continued rolling, and he rolled, as he described it, out of his body. His consciousness was looking at his body lying on the couch, and then from the ceiling. And he started experimenting. It was extraordinary. It was frightening to him. But he did, because he was an engineering type, he did some empirical studies. When he traveled, he went downtown to a service station, or auto mechanic, and he took note of everything he saw there. And when he came back, quote unquote, into his body and came to his normal consciousness, he wrote down everything he remembered. And then he drove down to that auto mechanic's place to check out whether what he'd seen was still there, and it confirmed it. And he had some many other extraordinary journeys out of the body, which is actually the title of a book he wrote. So, and of course, most people know Byron Katie, a wonderful Lumen spiritual teacher today. And we tell her story, too, the resurrection of a mad woman, because she went pretty crazy for a while, and she came back illumined. So, again, these stories are meant to give hope and perspective. My story, I don't put it in there just because it's my story, but the title of my story is Hidden Blessings, When Bad Luck Becomes Good Fortune. And you may recall, or you may not, maybe some of your listeners have read Way of the Peaceful Warrior, my first book, which is now out in a classic hardback edition, kind of a collector's item. But many people remember there's a story in there where it's about an old man and his son. They were poor farmers, and they only had one horse to pull the plow. And one day the horse ran away, and all the neighbors said, "Oh, what terrible fortune. We're so sorry you lost your horse." And the farmer shrugged and said, "I've given up trying to figure out what's good luck and what's bad luck. Things just happen." Well, as it happened, a week later, the horse returned, leading 5 wild horses into the corral. And all the neighbors said, "What great luck, what great fortune." And the farmer just shrugged and said, you really don't know about these things. Not long after, sure enough, his son, trying to tame one of the horses, fell off, broke his leg in 2 places. And all the neighbors again commiserated, but the farmer just shrugged. You never know. Not long after that, the army came to take all the young men to go to war, in which he'd almost certainly be killed. But the farmer's son was spared because of his broken leg. So the point is, we like to play God. This should have happened, this shouldn't have happened. Instead of accepting that we don't know whether something is ultimately good luck or bad luck. We might have a fender bender in traffic, and then we stop. We have to trade insurance forms. It's inconvenient. It's expensive. But that fender bender could have saved our life a mile ahead. You never know. In fact, I would define faith, F-A-I-T-H, the word faith, not as a belief in something, but as the courage to live as if everything that happens is for our highest good and learning. That's what faith is to me, the courage to live as if everything that happens is for our highest good. And that's why I decided to go work with Doug and write The Bridge Between Worlds, because it reminds us of that.
Well, and you brought up Doug again. So who is Doug? You said that you were friends. And, what's the story?
Well, I met Doug. We like martial arts, and he's skilled in Shaolin temple boxing. And we also were both involved at different times in a spiritual community many years ago. So we have that in common. And we just hit it off. And he's a writer. He's been an aspiring writer for some years. And he volunteered to look over one of my older manuscripts, and I thought he did a good job. So I asked him to look over some other ones as I wrote new books. And he was very useful. I liked his discernment. And then he began to do some writing on his own. He co-writes books for people who need help with a co-writer. Sometimes it's ghost-written, sometimes it's with Doug. And that's, his website is DougChilders.com. It's like child, but it's Childers, DougChilders.com. And he helps other writers, and he works on other projects, and he's working on some on his own. So he's a writer, he's an editor, and I respect him. And when he said, let's collaborate, again, I was reluctant because most authors like to kind of write their own books. But this was a fun collaboration. Now, somebody told me that many literary collaborations end up in arbitration because people have different perspectives on how it should be. But Doug and I are like twice or three times as good friends since we wrote the book than even before. We had a wonderful time. It wasn't about what's right. It's not about who's right. It's about what's right. He edited me. I edited him. And we ended up with probably maybe a better book than either one of us might have done individually. And Bridge Between Worlds was more his idea. He's a little more into some of these ideas in the book, but I had a wonderful time writing it. So that's how we got together for this particular book.
Well, and when the universe presents stuff to us, kind of like some of the stories that you've been sharing, part of that faith is going, okay, this is some kind of opportunity that is, well, as I said, presenting itself to us, and I just need to trust that I should move forward with this.
Yeah, exactly. I think what you're saying is exactly right. It's not that we have to necessarily do every opportunity that pops up. Some of them may be better than others. We have to use our discernment. But, yeah, when something comes up, it's worth looking at and breaking the habit, oh, no, I'm already planning on doing this. And sometimes we stop our plans. And I was about to start a major new novel that was The Journeys of Socrates, one of my books. The life story of my old mentor takes place in Russia. But instead I put that off to write this book with Doug. And people really enjoy it. What I like, it's stories. It's about 5 pages each. So if people are busy and don't have much time to write, or much time to read, they can just, read a story at night before they go to bed.
I also feel like it's the kind of book that if you're having kind of a funky day, you could just open it up to a story. You know how you do that? Open
Sure.
it up to a page out of Course in Miracles and just read that story, because I bet it would have a message in there that you need to learn that day in that moment.
Well, yeah, one story is called Awakened to Heal, and the other is called The Power of Love. And I think any good oracular book, people tell me that's true about Way of the Peaceful Warrior as well, that they can open to any page, as you say, and they'll find some message that's going to be useful for them. So I would agree. In fact, I might just share from the preface of the book, which I thought was worth the price of the book. We talk about healing and why physical healing doesn't always happen the way we might plan, but there might be healing on a deeper level, on a spiritual, emotional level. So anyway, this one paragraph says, taken together, these stories remind us that we live in a more mysterious and perhaps more perfect universe than we usually notice, that unexplored territory remains hidden behind the seemingly mundane surface of our daily lives, and that undreamed of possibilities may wait for us just on the other side of the bridge between worlds. And
Cool.
That's kind of the theme and why we wrote the book. And
I think one of my favorite stories and favorite characters is Padre Pio, who, I guess, back in the day, he was very famous, and he's kind of, lost his fame, or people don't really talk about him that much. And I was wondering if you could, because it was my personal favorite, if you could share that story, or at least part of some of that story, with the listeners.
I'd be glad to. That was one of the stories Doug had found through his research, because I hadn't heard of Padre Pio until Doug brought this to me. So let me just find it right here in the book, and I can just share. Modern Man of Miracles. Padre Pio. After Therese Newman, many people know her in the Catholic tradition. Padre Pio is perhaps the most widely observed modern Western mystic to demonstrate divine powers of healing and regeneration. And the first sign of his extraordinary qualities occurred unexpectedly in 1918. It was a September day when a 31-year-old Capuchin monk, he was sitting alone in the monastery chapel praying after Mass. Outside, Padre Leon heard a scream within the chapel and ran to find Pio lying unconscious on the floor, bleeding profusely from 5 wounds of the stigmata. As most people know, these are the wounds that Christ had in his hands and feet. Several monks carried Padre Pio to his room, where he begged them to keep his condition a secret, but word spread. The church quickly put a ban of silence on him, concerned that this untested monk might be manifesting symptoms of hysteria. He was forbidden to write or speak in public and so on. But like Therese Newman, he bore for his entire life wounds of the stigmata that never healed. And thousands of individuals, from ordinary Italian peasants and fellow clerics to high public officials and pilgrims around the world, witnessed and testified to his powers of telepathy, prophecy, bilocation, levitation, and healing. And it goes on. It's very well documented kind of material. So it's not saying that, oh, you too, no matter what illness you have, can magically be healed. It's not about that. We don't know what should happen to ourselves or anyone else. That's what I said. That's where faith comes in. But these examples can inspire us, uplift us, maybe open us to some higher possibilities instead of getting completely caught up, even as we address the modern responsibilities, of everyday life.
Okay, so I shared my favorite story. If you had to pick one, would you share that with the listeners?
It's funny that you asked that, Rita, because some people ask me, since I've written 14 books so far, and I've got some new ones coming out, one later this year and one next year, people say, which is your favorite book, Dan? And expecting maybe I'd say Way of the Peaceful Warrior, because that's the best known. But I ask them, do you have any children? And sometimes they go, oh, yes, I do. And I go, which is your favorite? and they get the point that every book is different. It's not a matter of having favorites, and every story is also different in the book. But I will say that I was actually flabbergasted by one of the stories. I'd never heard of Emanuel Swedenborg. Maybe some of your listeners have, maybe you have. I had not. And when Doug sent this story to me and said, why don't you look it over, edit it, and so on, this guy, Swedenborg, was in his home country of Sweden. He was a respected Renaissance man. Among his many positions, he served as the king's appointed royal scientist, member of the Swedish House of Nobles, where he wrote legislative bills in the areas of national interest. He was fluent in 9 languages. He wrote primarily in Latin, the scholarly language of the day. In his spare time, he learned to bind books and make watches, cabinets, and scientific instruments. He was an astronomer, medical scientist, mechanical engineer. He ground lenses to build his own microscopes and telescope. He designed, among other things, an air gun, a submarine, never built, an airplane, built and flown 2 centuries later, in the early 1900s, a music machine, a house theater, a fire extinguisher. He designed the world's first and largest dry dock. Then, for the King of Sweden, he supervised transport of a fleet of ships 14 miles over the mountains. Oh, well, this doesn't sound so spiritual at first, but he was so brilliant. He had, by the age of 56, he had mastered all known branches of science and developed several new ones. He had written 150 books summarizing the discoveries of knowledge in each of these various fields. Then, in the process, after he had recapitulated all human knowledge to his era, he decided to prove the existence of the soul. In the process, he became a mystic. And it gets into his mystical side and his powers of prediction and all he'd achieved in a worldly sense, he began to explore in the spiritual sense, and it goes on at some length about some things he did that just couldn't be explained other than his ability to be different places at once, or at least know what was going on.
I can't imagine having enough time in the day to do all those things.
This guy was extraordinary. I mean, there's a church built around him today. There's a whole community I once visited and gave a talk at, the Swedenborgian community. He was an extraordinary man most of us haven't even heard of. So that was one of the stories that kind of floored me. And there's stories about women, of course, as well as men. Peace Pilgrim is in there, and as I said, Byron Katie. So it's been a great ride.
Dan, where can people get the book?
It's on sale at all bookstores, online, and so on. Bridge Between Worlds.
Bridge Between Worlds. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we'll have you back on when your next book comes out.
My pleasure. Always nice to visit with you.
All right. Bye-bye, Dan.
Take care.
That's Dan Millman, Bridge Between Two Worlds. After these messages,
Just
we'll be
Energy
back with
Radio
Michael
with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
you sensitive to energy? Want to explore the world beyond the five senses? Looking for a new career as an alternative healthcare practitioner? Then the Institute of Applied Energetics, Medical Intuition, and Energy Medicine training programs may be right for you. Our comprehensive curriculum provides students with a deep understanding of how to detect, evaluate, and transform the subtle body, as well as techniques for correcting energetic imbalances that may underscore a person's ability to experience radiant health. So if you are sensitive to energy, contact the Institute of Applied Energetics right away. Be a catalyst for changing the way healthcare is done around the world. Visit www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and start your new career today. How would you like to live long and enjoy great health? How about creating solid bones and whiter teeth? Strengthen your heart and eyes and have radiant, youthful-looking skin. There is an ancient health and longevity secret that has been used for millennia in Egypt, India, and China that can help you achieve this. For the first time in the modern world, Pearlsium brings this ancient wellness secret to you. For more information about Pearlsium, visit www.productsforthesoul.com. Before we get back to the show, I would like to thank all of you for tuning into Just Energy Radio. Many of the people I've helped over the years were listeners just like you. If you're at a junction in your life, don't stand alone at this important time. Call me or send me an email. We can set up a private consultation so that you too can experience health, healing, and wholeness in your life.
Michael,
to find out more about the services I offer, visit www.soulhealer.com.
Good, hold on.